Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today I'll be sharing how to make the scoped text effect. This effect will look as though you're peeking through a scope of a sniper rifle. Unlike the magnify effect I featured on previous video, it has no lens distortion, but theoretically there is no limit to the amount you can zoom in. It is a cool looking effect, so I encourage you to follow along. Alright, let's get into it. Alright, as soon as we get into Blender, we'll hop right into Geometry Nodes Layout, H select all, X to delete. Shift A, add mesh plane. Using numpad 7 and 5, we'll go into top orthographic view. Click on new, pin the map, delete group input. Instead, add a string input. Type something like test. Pass it through strings to curve, then output. Alright, so today's effect is going to be a scoped text effect. So just imagine like a sniper rifle scope. If we are focusing right here, we're going to have a outer circle that represents the actual scope. And whatever is in the scope is going to be deleted, but imagine there's going to be another smaller circle which represents the regions that we're zooming into. We're going to cut that part out and expand it to the size of the scope, like so. Okay. So the operation itself is quite simple. All we do is pretty much mesh boolean and scale. So let's get into it. Right, so the first thing we're going to be doing is realizing the mesh, realizing the instance first, then resample to add more points to control, change it to length and change the value to 0.01. Next, we'll go through with filling the curve. We'll set the type to ngon, and the text part is pretty much done. Now we're going to be adding a scope object, which we'll represent by using an empty plane axis. So we are going to be controlling the scope, the location, and the size of the scope, and also the magnifying ratio with this empty. So we'll drag this guy into the map and change the setting to relative. And we will also add another circle, which we'll use as a mesh circle. We'll use a mesh circle, change the fill type to ngon, increase the vertices maybe to about like 64, and for radius we're gonna pop the scale into radius like so. So I'll join geometry and output. Okay, let's go into wireframe so we can view it easier. So right now the circle is overlapping the empty perfectly. So if I were to change the size of the empty, the circle changes as well. Okay. We also want the location to change, so we'll add a transform geometry right after the mesh circle and plug in the location into translation, like so. So now the circle is following the empty, like so. Okay. All right. Next, what we want to do is take a mesh boolean, but mesh boolean with two planes are not gonna work well. So what I'm gonna do is use an extrude mesh and change the circle into a cylinder, like so. Then I'm gonna add a mesh boolean. Mesh boolean. Keep it as difference. Plug in the fill curve into mesh 1 and result of extrude mesh into mesh 2, And what's going to happen is we're going to have a difference of, well, the circle and the text, like so. So anywhere that's now overlapping is going to be showing up. Okay, so the first scope part is done, but we want to make that smaller circle, which we're going to use to expand and scale. So what I'm going to do is drag over all these nodes from object info to mesh boolean, Control Shift D to duplicate with lines, and we will be making another circle which represents a smaller zoom area. Okay, so I'm gonna move this around like here. So what we want to do is make a smaller circle, but how do we want to make it? Well, the circle is gonna be based on a magnifying ratio. So let's say we're gonna be zooming in to a ratio of 2. What we're gonna have to do is do a mass and change this to divide. I'll drop it between scale and radius and plug in this value into here. Okay, and let me just also output this. Okay, right, so we have this smaller circle, and what we want to do is cut out this circle part. So I'm going to change this mesh boolean from difference to intersect and reconnect the fill curve to here. Okay, and if I output, you can see that it's now cutting out right here. We want to expand it so it matches the outer circle. So I'm going to do is scale elements and pop right in after mesh boolean. Using the value, the magnifying ratio into scale and center, we're going to use this location. Okay. Now you can see that the smaller circle just expanded to match the exterior circle. Okay. So now what we need to do is delete these lines going into join geometry. I'm just going to move this over here and connect the cutout to two of them to join geometry. The one that's cutting the outer part and the one that's smaller interior of the scope. Okay. So the effect is pretty much complete. If I were to move this empty around, you can see it's basically zooming into wherever the empty is. Okay. Right now, actually, let me just reroute so it's easier to see. Okay. Reroute here as well. Okay. Something like this. Right. So, right now we are kind of fixed on the magnifying ratio of 2, which I want to make it so I can control that as well externally. So I'm going to be using this rotation. I'm going to use a separate XYZ. And using the Z rotation, I'm going to pull out a map range. And from the top, I'm going to go negative pi, 1, and 10. And I'm going to plug this guy into wherever the 2 was plugged into. I don't need that 2 anymore, so it's going to be like so. Okay, so now I can rotate this empty and change the ratio. Okay, so I can change the location, I can change the size, and I can change the zoom ratio. Okay. Right, so all you have to do for animation is animate this empty object. So I'm not gonna actually go over that, but what I want to do is show you, just like the last time when I did a magnifying effect, there's gonna be issues with textures if you don't actually take care of it, which is I'm just gonna explain it. So I'm gonna add a material right here, change it to default material, pull out a shader editor, and if you have the empty selected, make sure you're selecting the text, and on pin, select the default material and pin it again so you don't have to switch back. Right, so I'm gonna delete the principal BSDF and I'm gonna use a checker texture so I can explain it easier. Let's go to render view, and if I were to move this empty around, you can see that the texture is not in sync with the mesh, and that happens because we're taking the vector that is coming out of result of these operations, right? So what we want to do is reference the original text. So what I need to do is use a store named attribute, go in here, and I'm gonna change it to vector and face corner, and I'm gonna call this pause, and I'm gonna store a position, the original position, into here. Okay, so now for the material, I'm going to use the attribute and use the position, use the vector, and plug it into here, right? I'm going to increase the scale so it's easier to see. And if I were now to move this around, you can see that mesh and the texture is in sync, right? So I'm explaining it with checker texture, but if you're trying to use like any kind of, you know, other image texture or any other texture for that matter, you'll probably want to store this original position so it's gonna look more like it's zooming in. Okay. Right. Last thing is just as a word of advice, since we're using a couple heavy operations like mesh booleans, if you want to use a bake to speed up some process, the place that I would recommend using a bake is here, right after the store named attribute. It's going to optimize this fill curve, but since we're going to be using this these parts for animation, I don't think you're going to be able to reduce the operation amount for these guys. So if you were to use a bake, I'd recommend here. Alright, let's summarize what we did. So you can kind of imagine there's three parts to it. So the original text part, the exterior scope part, and the interior circle, which you're going to use for zooming in. So basically 3 parts to this node tree. Alright. It's a quite cool effect. Theoretically you can zoom into infinite value, but I mean, I'm pretty sure you want to keep it at a reasonable level, but it's a pretty nice effect. You can play around with it, so yeah, just enjoy and see you next time.